So I think when we talk about economic empowerment, it's not, the land. I mean, if you think of vast stretches of the Karoo, for example, that land is not very usable except for maybe grazing some sheep. The land is only productive insofar as you utilize it and you invest in it and you have certainty over your investments. I think the mining industry is a very good example of this, and use that term white anting away, which I think is applicable to the mining industry. And you would struggle to think of a country on earth that has a richer mineral endowment than South Africa. Maybe the DRC, but that just illustrates my point, which is that the mere presence of minerals does not guarantee wealth. But I think in the NDR conceptualization, this is the kind of the national wealth that just needs to be captured by the state and redistributed more equitably. Perhaps you could offer a few comments on, it's not just kind of individual ownership, but also whole industries that have been undermined in this way.
Yeah, no, absolutely. There has to be confidence that property rights are secure before individuals can invest in the homes where they live and build up an asset, and before a mining company can embark on the vast expenditure of sinking a shaft and putting in all the equipment that is needed for mining, unless you're very confident that you have a secure property right. It's just too risky to put in money in that way. And the Democratic Republic of the Congo is precisely the illustration of that. So here in South Africa, we have obviously an enormously successful mining industry. It's been the foundation of the modernization and industrialization of the country over decades. And when the ANC came in 1994, one of the things clearly that it wanted to do was to give the state more control. And it has begun with the taking of custodianship over mineral resources. In other words, it said, if you think about the mineral resources which are unsevered there in the ground, those should be in the custodianship of the state. And then if you want to be able to mine them, you must apply to us for a mining right. And it is an approach that's increasingly being taken in many countries. But there was a critical difference here. In South Africa, 2/3 of those mineral resources were privately owned. So when the ANC took custodianship of them, that private ownership simply came to an end. And there was talk that there was 100 billion rand at stake. This is what the sort of compensation that should have been provided to the mining companies that had owned those mineral resources. And nothing was paid because the ANC used the mechanism of custodianship.
Just through the stroke of a regulator's pen.
And it's probably worth just telling the story of the key case which helped to establish this, where a company bought a coal mining right for 1 million rand. And it had never been used, but it was a valuable asset. And then came the law in the Mineral and Petroleum Resources Development Act, in terms of which the custodianship of all mineral resources was vested in the ANC, the state. And then if you didn't manage to convert your mining right in time, it ceased to exist. So they didn't manage to convert because they didn't have the money for the fee, ceased to exist, it went to court. Initially, it went to the Pretoria High Court, who said, well, the company used to have a mining right. Effectively, it's now with the state. It doesn't really matter what the state calls it, whether it's ownership, custodianship, whatever. All the powers of ownership have gone to the government, expropriation, and they should pay compensation. But it went to the Constitutional Court. They said there's a difference. The assumption of custodianship is different from the acquisition of ownership. And our Constitution says that it's on the acquisition of ownership that you have to pay compensation. Our Constitution doesn't say that. It does talk about expropriation having to be accompanied by compensation, but it doesn't define expropriation. And it certainly doesn't define it as being limited to the acquisition of ownership. But this was a very useful judgment for the ANC, penned by Chief Justice Mogoeng.
This is the Agri-SA case.
And this was now in the Agri-SA case, on the basis of which, because the state had taken custodianship rather than ownership, there was no compensation to be paid. And so the ANC sees custodianship as a very useful way of now being able to extend this concept to land in general. Going back to what we had in the Constitutional Amendment Act, which did talk about custodianship. Expropriation Act doesn't mention custodianship anywhere, but it has this narrow definition of expropriation. And it seeks to define expropriation as the compulsory acquisition of ownership. And then one fears that further down the line, the ANC will pass another statute which gives the state custodianship of certain land, whatever that might be. And then they will argue that there's no taking of ownership, so there's no expropriation, so there's no question of compensation. And they will seek to rely on the Agri-SA case, which is an extraordinarily weak case. I think it can be perhaps overturned by appealing to the Constitutional Court to rethink it, if only on the basis that they were wrong to talk about custodianship at all, because under the MPRDA, you vested the mineral resources in the ground in the state. And this was a fight about a mining right, which is quite a different thing. So they completely mistook what they were dealing with. And I think one could in many ways challenge the really the weakness of that case and say it shouldn't be seen as setting a precedent.
Yeah, and the effects of this on the mining industry have been devastating. In the paper that you wrote recently, which was something of an update to the Countdown to Socialism book, just kind of bringing up to date some of the kind of new facts and analysis, and we'll link to that in the description. I mean, you indicate that in 2002, I think it was, South Africa's percentage of mining prospecting globally was about 5%. So and that is a very costly exercise to engage in prospecting. It's a form of investment itself. So it went from about 5% to about 0.8% today in, I think, 2024, 2023. That's a precipitous decline.
Yes, because, countries, mining jurisdictions around the world compete to really appeal, I suppose, to mining companies to take their money to invest in exploration, which, as you say, is a very risky thing. You don't know necessarily that you're going to find anything worthwhile. And yet South Africa had such an attractive, not only mineral resources, but policy environment that we were able to attract 5% of the global total. Now we get so much less than that. And why is it? Because once the state had taken custodianship and they had introduced this new regimen for obtaining mining rights and added to that a whole number of obligations on the empowerment front. And empowerment obviously has a great appeal, I think, to many people, again, given past injustice. The idea is that perhaps you can make it easier for the poor to get ahead. But what has happened with the ANC's empowerment initiatives is that the benefits have gone almost entirely to a small and often politically connected elite. So in the mining sphere, for example, now you had to have 26% historically disadvantaged South Africans with ownership of your mining company. And obviously most people wouldn't have the money. So the mining company would very often lend the money to the purchaser, who was supposed to pay back, but very often didn't. And so it was enormously expensive for a mining company to do that. And for a prospective investor, they look at the possibility of, well, the reality that you have to put in 26%, or for Elon Musk now with Starlink, in a different sector where you have to put in 30%. And they say, we're not going to do that.
Yeah, I think a very illustrative example of this kind of resource nationalism was in the wake of some of the pressure from the Trump administration, Gwede Mantashe, the mining minister, saying, well, if they're going to hit us with sanctions or with tariffs, then we're not going to sell our minerals to the United States, assuming that it's his minerals to sell in the first place. And ironically, we've undermined our own strategic advantage, any leverage we may have had, because we've made it almost impossible to get those minerals out of the ground and to market in the first place, which undermines our national interest.
And now, in terms of what the ANC has in mind, there'll be two further bases on which he might be able to stop our minerals going to the US once they've been dug out of the ground at this enormous cost. because they have two things in mind. First of all, that there'll be a vague obligation that every mining rights holder, every mining company must set aside a certain amount of the minerals that they have mined for beneficiation locally. And secondly, they'll have a list of critical minerals, which we don't know how they will control them in the future. But certainly in the past, they saw the capacity of adding export duties, which would make it very expensive to export them. So it's just another way in which the minister would like to be able to say, well, maybe I'm not going to send my platinum to the US, irrespective of whether that's a sensible thing for the country.
Because he's empowered to do so.
Yeah.
And we now have these massive natural gas discoveries off of the west coast of South Africa and other places. It seems like that could potentially be a target for some of these NDR policies of command and control and centralization, more resource nationalism. Do we see any potential threats of that?
Yes, indeed. The Upstream Petroleum Resources Development Act was adopted last year. It hasn't come into effect yet, but it has various worrying provisions. One is that there's a 20% carried interest for the state. So the other thing is that there needs to be a 10% BEE stake. So immediately any company coming in to embark on the enormous cost of trying to drill offshore in a situation where you've got to explore to begin with because you're not quite sure what's there. We know that there are good proven resources in Namibia. There's a belief that this resource is available all the way down the west coast, even to south of Cape Town, but you've got to find it, and then you've got to be able to extract it. But you've also got to hand over effectively 30% to the state and to a BEE investor. And though there is obviously provision that in the end the state should contribute to production and exploration costs, we know that our government is tremendously tardy very often in meeting obligations, that it doesn't pay its bills, sometimes in the most crude and blatant ways. And so there must also be some doubt as to whether these obligations will in fact be met. You need an excellent partner in a state if you're going to go into that kind of arrangement. And we have a state that seems to be filled with cadres who are loyal to the National Democratic Revolution, who don't have the best interests of the country at heart. They might think that they are pursuing an incredibly important socialist revolution, but all of those socialist revolutions end up by widening inequality, where the great masses have equal poverty and the small elite at the top has enormous power and wealth. So there's a self-interest too in those cadres, as much as they might claim to be working for the benefit of the poor. They know the way it works in a socialist country is this vast difference between the small elite at the top, very wealthy, very powerful, and the great mass of everybody at the bottom, very dependent on what the state provides, what the state is willing and able to provide.
Yeah, it's a narrow sectional interest that is being served here, not a broader national interest.
Yes, indeed. Yeah.